tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I spoke in the previous show with my colleague Rachel Emanuel about the Alberta election, which is currently underway right now. We're getting all the press releases from all the candidates. They're announcing their platforms. Yesterday, Rachel Notley, the former premier seeking to return to the seat, had a press conference in which she said she wanted to send a message to Conservatives that were thinking of voting NDP for the first time. And I was like, well, this actually sounds quite interesting. So I went on Zoom, because you could connect via Zoom, and I joined the press conference, and you have to click the raise hand button if you want to ask a question. And they never called on me, the only one on that press conference that has, I'd say, probably a larger share of Conservatives in the audience that are the people Ms. Notley ostensibly wants to speak to. But they called on one reporter twice. So that was how much they really didn't want me to ask her a question. But when we talk about this election, I think we need to also take a look back into 4 years ago, the election that elected Jason Kenney as premier of the UCP government, the first ever UCP government. And one particular story that may not be politically relevant to a lot of people now, but is culturally relevant and is incredibly relevant to the individual at the center of that story. And that is Caylan Ford, who I have interviewed in the past, and we'll talk a little bit about that in this show. She was a star candidate, called a unicorn by some people in the 2019 election. She was running for the UCP in a seat that wasn't a traditionally conservative seat, but they thought was within reach, incredibly well-educated, incredibly eloquent, and was the victim of a horrific smear campaign by someone who she once called a friend. And that smear campaign was very much enabled by mainstream media outlets and by some alternative media outlets. And Caylan Ford has released a new documentary about this ordeal and also about the broader themes it touches on. It's called When the Mob Came. And Caylan joins me now. Caylan, it's good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on today, first of all.
Thanks, Andrew. And to clarify, the documentary is, as we speak, being rendered and will be released later tonight. So
okay,
don't think it's done, but later this evening it should be public. And yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate that clarification. And I had the good fortune of being able to see an advance copy of it, which was quite compelling. And even having followed your story and having known you in some capacity, I learned things from it and was forced to reflect on certain things. And I don't want to rehash a lot of the details that the people can find for themselves, but I'll ask firstly why you wanted to do this, because for someone that's gone through what you went through, it wouldn't surprise me if you wanted to just kind of shut the door and lock it on that chapter of your life and move on. And I know you've done that largely. You've started a fantastic school in Calgary. You're trying to open one in Edmonton as well. Why go back to this time in your life?
Well, so in answer to that question, look, we talk about people being canceled, and there's obviously a spectrum, right? Some people might be deplatformed on one or several occasions. In my case, my life was annihilated. I was on the front page of the Toronto Star 4 times. They said I came from a trash heap and that I had been caught promoting white supremacy. 3 different CBC headlines said that I basically was a white supremacist. It was on CBC's The National with Wendy Mesley. And it didn't stop for a month. So it was almost daily coverage, making these claims about me. Any attempt that I made to try to tell my own side of the story ended up suppressed. We can get into that. Employers wouldn't engage with me. I was told I couldn't sit on charitable boards. Friends left me. They faced ostracism from their social circles if they continued engaging with me. This was complete character assassination. I couldn't earn a livelihood. It took me almost 4 years before I was able to get new employment. And that was through an organization that I founded. So I was persona non grata. I couldn't just move on. And this is one of the misconceptions that I hope this documentary will maybe prompt people to reflect on, is when you are subject to this sort of like shame storm, the media will move on, the mob will move on. That person's life has been completely torn through. And they can't just always pick up the pieces and sort of reassemble it. So on the one hand, this was, I had no platform to tell the story, and I had no employment. But I did have a background in documentary filmmaking, which is very fortuitous.
One of the interesting dynamics here is that you're obviously interviewing some of the people in this documentary. You're releasing it, but you're featured in it, and it's about you. And there are other people that are being interviewed about you. And I'm wondering why, just from a production standpoint, you decided to approach it in such a personal way. Because oftentimes, and I know this is someone who's written about cancel culture, there can be a temptation to deal with it in the abstract because it's a bit safer. You can talk about other people being canceled and hope that that may, in a roundabout way, kind of get people to sort of take your side on it without having to really expose yourself again.
Yeah. So making a documentary about my own life is horrifying. It is, I was sharing with you, it feels to me like just the height of narcissistic self-indulgence. And it's very obvious, and I'm very upfront about the fact that this is a persuasive piece, that my goal is actually to change people's minds about me. And that's extremely personal. I'm kind of like laying my heart bare for the world, and I may or may not find that's a cathartic event. But yeah, it is challenging. You'll notice in the film I often slip into speaking in the third person, and I think that's a coping mechanism that I acquired to try to intellectualize the experience, because I found it's very difficult to talk about me in this context. But yeah, so that's really challenging. I had to the way I tried to overcome that was by dressing it up intellectually and sort of couching it in a philosophical framework. So the entire documentary is actually kind of framed by Plato's Gorgias dialogue. And the central thesis, if I might summarize, that comes from that dialogue is that we should take greater care to avoid doing wrong than we should to avoid suffering wrong. And that above all else, we should care about actually being good, and rather than making people believe that we're good. And this relates to cancel culture in the sense that I think cancel culture, it's obviously not culture, it's an anti-culture, but it's a culture of intellectual and moral inversion, where false virtues, or the performance of false virtues, is celebrated at the expense of the real thing. And so this is a documentary about, well, is it better to strive for the real thing, or to sort of perform the counterfeit? And is it better to suffer injury, or to do it from the vantage point of the soul? So this is how I've tried to overcome the difficulty of turning the lens on myself and my own life.
One of the challenges that I believe you would presumably admit you faced is that you are, as people can tell, I think from your answer there and from any of your other work, an incredibly intellectual person. You're a very cerebral person. You're well-read. You have references dating back thousands of years for things. And intellectual exercises are not really all that fitting in modern politics, which is about sound bites and brevities. There's one, little illumination of this in the documentary when your former campaign manager is talking about canvassing, which is when you go knocking on doors, and your role in the party's view of things is to knock on a door to find out if they're voting for you or not and move on to the next door. You're not trying to persuade them, you're trying to identify them. Whereas your view was the one that would make campaign managers have an aneurysm, which is let's sit and have a conversation for 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And how difficult is that for you, coming from an academic background and an intellectual background where you believe that everything can be approached with reason and that every kind of conflict can be the start of a conversation, when I think the crux of the problem here is that you have people that aren't interested in conversations, that aren't interested in challenging their perceptions, however wrong they are?
Yeah, and you see me struggle with that in the film, I think, because my general assumption is that people are reasonable and they can be reasoned with. On the campaign trail, I actually found that assumption was usually borne out. Most, generally, people, when you meet them face to face, they are quite reasonable. But
Yeah, that's the Twitter is not real life thesis, which I generally agree with.
Yeah, exactly. But I was really struggling with this, and I think part of the explanation is people who deploy the tools of cancel culture. I just take for granted that most people assume that truth is good, and that in the case of a dispute or a sort of moral contestation, you can engage in dialectical conversation where both parties are aiming toward truth. And this is the means by which disagreements can be adjudicated. But if you're dealing with people who don't believe truth is good, then it has no moral weight. You can't appeal to it. It doesn't make any sense to try to say, what you're saying is untrue. They don't care. The point is to suppress truth in the hopes that by doing so, you will create some space for a new reality, a supposedly better reality to flourish. And so that's why cancel culture sort of undermines the fundamental logic of civilization. It destroys even the most sort of fundamental means by which we might adjudicate disagreements. But yeah, you see me like struggling with that at a very personal level in the film.
Well, and you mentioned something which I think was incredibly astute, which I hadn't really thought of, which is that, and I'm going to butcher your line, so I won't pretend I'm quoting it accurately, but the premise of it was that cancel culture only works if there's an institutional application of it, and that everyone just shouting in the void about how you are X or Y is not really cancel culture. It's when some other organ, whether it's a political party or an employer or a media outlet, decides we're going to apply this to reality. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, well, so there's kind of two dimensions to cancel culture. There's the public shaming and the deplatforming. And cancel culture is sort of when these two things come together. So the public shaming, so having people sort of say terrible things about you on a very large scale, that is a devastating experience. And anyone who has gone through it will know, even when it's just online, it affects you very deeply. It triggers a sort of fight or flight response. It makes you question your perception of reality and your beliefs about yourself. So it's devastating. But what the sort of mob aims to do is not just to humiliate you or harass you. It is to appeal to authorities to strip you of your platform, your livelihood, your ability to speak, your ability to defend yourself. So they're asking institutions, they're asking people in positions of power, whether it's your employer or media outlet or a venue or whatever, in my case, a political party and others, they're asking them to sort of deperson you. And so the actual cancellation is only effected through an act of institutional capitulation. It is, you have to have someone willing to submit to the demands of the mob for this to actually be, for it to work.
One of the things that I found quite interesting is that I don't know if it was intentional on your part, but that there seems to be a bit of conflict even in the way you discuss it about whether you did anything wrong. And I think generally speaking, you are of the mind, or should be of the mind, that you didn't. But it's very easy when discussing it to fall into that trap of wanting to make amends still.
Yeah. So look, when from my vantage point, it looked to me like the entire world was saying that I was a terrible person, that I was morally abhorrent. People, if you read the tweets carefully that appear on the screen, you'll see people saying, your family should be so ashamed. You deserve to be exiled. It's great you'll never work again. The person who outed you is full of courage. We should have more people like him in politics. Things like this. And moreover, like I said, employers wouldn't touch me, wouldn't respond to me, like media wouldn't engage with me. So you start to really doubt your perception of reality. And what happens when the outside world seems to have one view and you hold an internal perception that's different, this creates a deep dissonance that you're naturally going to try to want to resolve somehow. And there's sort of three main ways that you can try to resolve that. You can either try to persuade the world to see things as you do, or you can adopt the world's view of you, or you can go a kind of stoical approach where you separate the internal from the external and you no longer rely on any kind of external validation to tell you what's true. You're just sort of guided by, sort of faith in things unseen. And I kind of oscillate between all three of those. And so you'll see me really grappling with, well, why are thousands of people demanding apologies from me? Why is a premier, two premiers, and a mayor of a city, and all of these news, sort of media figures, why are they all asking me to apologize? For what? And I really grappled with this question, and I would ask people in earnest, what have I done wrong? Because I don't understand. And I never got an answer.
When you talk about the employer aspect of this, I mean, the one thing that really is the most jarring about cancel culture, defenders of it will often say, well, it's not about cancel culture, it's consequence culture. They say that, they almost appeal actually to conservative language where they say, well, no, it's about justice, it's about consequences, it's about the idea of the marketplace of ideas. And the problem with that is that no one who fuels this is interested in proportionality. They don't say, you sped, so you should get a speeding ticket and pay it and move on with your life. It's like everything's the death penalty, basically, to use an extreme. I'm actually, to be honest, it's not even all that extreme in some cases with how they view. And that's the problem here. So it's that even if people believed you were unfit to be a candidate, which I don't feel was the case, that's not what they wanted. They wanted you stripped of your party membership. They wanted you prevented from working again. There would be people that would have said, I'm sure her family should disown her and her friends should disown her. And if you were to get a job as a barista at Starbucks, that would be offensive to them. And I was wondering if you could, not if you could, but if you have come up with an explanation for why. Why is that the case? Why is it so extreme in a sense that I don't think anyone could, if you were to talk to them one-on-one, explain how saying this thing, even if it was what they claimed, warrants this outcome?
So you've touched on one big aspect of what's wrong with cancel culture, which is that it's not actually an administration of justice. It's not justice because there's nothing resembling due process. There's no rules of evidence. There's no right to a defense or presumption of innocence, or all of these things that we would associate with.
Or to face your accuser in your case.
To face your accuser, right? I had an anonymous accuser, and I was further publicly shamed for identifying him. I now have a restraining order against him. My case led to the recognition of a new tort of civil harassment in Alberta. That was the person accusing me, who was trumpeted as a hero in the media. So that's the deeper problem, is that cancel culture reflects a complete failure of clear moral reasoning. If you start to think that sort of quasi-criminal harassment is okay and defensible and good, if their target is someone who has an opinion you disagree with, then you are morally it's not that you're morally and intellectually bankrupt if you think that. So it's that the crimes that they identify don't make any sense. You never see people being canceled for actual criminal acts. You see people being canceled for often extremely ambiguous violations of emergent social norms, or of social norms that a small minority wants to see sort of in ascendancy. So I think that's the deeper problem, is that having an opinion or observing a fact or asking a question in good faith is just not really a transgression that merits this. But on the other side, the people who engage in cancel culture, I talked earlier about how it celebrates false virtues at the expense of the real ones. What I mean is that cancel culture aims to snuff out loyalty, charity, forgiveness, a commitment to truth, a slowness to judge, friendship, solidarity. All of these kinds of virtues are suffocated in the climate created by cancel culture. And the fake sort of performative virtues are outrage, a quickness to judge, to believe the worst of other people, to listen to slander, to make sure that person is injured permanently. So that's, I think, the real problem with this phenomenon, and it leads to a complete breakdown. You were talking earlier on your show about the long effects of COVID. It destroys social trust and solidarity and sort of social comity, and cancel culture has the same effect.
There is obviously this cultural and social dimension to your story, and there's also a media story. And I know there's a lawsuit underway that you've waged that touches on this. But to further the discussion of just the lack of proportionality, it wasn't enough that these allegations had you dethroned from your spot as a candidate and prospective MLA, but the deplatforming continued long after that. Anytime you popped up to tell your story, like on Danielle Smith's show with me, even that was seen as offensive to the mob, for you to have the right, even after you've already paid the price, to discuss it.
Yeah. So this is a plot point in the documentary, but the first public interview I did was on now Premier Danielle Smith's show, and the sort of NDP acolytes, Progress Alberta, which was basically a sort of third-party advertiser or PAC for the NDP, they put out a petition saying she should be driven off the air, she needs to apologize, or they're going to go after their advertisers. Former Calgary Mayor Naheed Nenshi was agreeing with the premise of this petition, telling reporters that they should boycott her show. And then the person who was behind the accusations against me also threatened legal action against them, Karim Divraj. And eventually they capitulated. Chorus took down the interview from all their platforms, and something very similar happened to you.
Yep.
That's your cue to elaborate.
Well, it's I don't, to be honest, I don't know what more I can say on that. I mean, it was very difficult for me because when you and I did that interview, I think it was almost an hour in length. It was very difficult to do for me as well because I had gone through my own experience, not as national as yours was in 2018, and there was a bit of a catharsis in that conversation, and then to have that sort of interview, and not just sort of threatened with legal action, but then even when you re-uploaded it on your own platform, that sort of continued. Of I was sort of asked why are you letting her do it? I was like, I had nothing to do with it. But it struck me as just so profound. It goes back to what you said about the lack of justice in this, that even someone being able to defend themselves, or even not even defend because the damage had been done, but to put on record their side of the story was something that was continually taken away. And it's I don't have words for it. It's terrible.
Yes, it is.
And I guess my question to you would be, how much of that, when you had people disowning you, and you had media that kind of was doing what we just described, how much of that was from people that, in your view, knew it was all nonsense and went along with it, versus people that actually believed maybe there was a kernel of truth to it?
Yeah, the difference between the expression, the public versus the private opinions that people expressed was very stark. Cancel culture is it's a preference falsification machine, because when you see all these people on Twitter sort of saying terrible things about you, attacking anyone who dares to defend you, or even sort of withhold judgment about you, it creates a climate of terror that leads people to believe, well, it's not safe to support this person. Now, that's a false appearance, because Twitter isn't representative of real life. Media is not representative of real life. In real life, people were, for the most part, exceedingly generous, kind. I still get people to this day who will come up to me and say sorry for what happened to me. And it was the complete opposite in the sort of online and public realm. People felt that they could not do this. So, the one of the journalists who tried writing a kind of investigative feature story about what had actually happened here, he found it was very, very challenging to get people willing to go on the record, that they would privately say, what an injustice, this is so terrible, and they couldn't say so publicly. So you sort of, and speaking of, like, where is the kind of the moral, the damage? I expect the NDP to behave the way they behave, right? In a way, and I have legal recourse there. So I've launched a $7 million defamation suit against the CBC, the Toronto Star, the NDP, Progress Alberta, all the others. Where there's no recourse and where there's no comprehension is the betrayal of friends. And I don't know if you've had analogous experiences, but betrayal is one of the strangest forms of suffering, because it's one that can really turn into an internal affliction because it remains incomprehensible. You can never ask people, why did you abandon me in my hour of need, right? So that's actually the one that kind of cuts deeper.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, in my case, I was fortunate that it didn't happen hugely. The bigger issue was people that were the quiet friends, but they're only quiet friends, and the challenge that I experienced was that the way that I could sort of reconcile what was happening was that, well, everyone who knows me knows it's nonsense. So when someone who does know you doesn't behave the way most of the people who know you are, it does force you to sort of question, wait, maybe. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and you start to internalize some of what other people are saying. And just to be more precise on the media side of things, I'll say, and I'm not proud of this by any stretch, but litigation and the threat of litigation are very powerful forces. I mean, when a company, be it True North or Chorus, is served with a legal notice, I mean, it very much triggers that political impulse of, well, making it go away, because not everyone has the capacity or the bandwidth or the funds to make everything the hill to die on. So you've actually turned around and have used this process to seek justice. And I'm wondering if you were optimistic that would work.
With the litigation, yeah.
Yeah.
Look, yeah. So I mean, for context, I you and Chorus and one other podcast were served with legal notice from Jivraj. Other podcasters were threatened with legal action. He never pursued any of that. It's a bluff because everything that I've said was true, and he knows that. But if you're a small outlet, that's a potent threat. And but I'm now 2 years into discovery against some of the nation's biggest media outlets, and obviously I can't say too much about that. I don't want to breach the implied undertaking rule, but I am more optimistic now, having learned what I've learned, than I was when I started this process. But it is a long process, and it's very costly. And that's kind of one of the perverse ironies of being cancelled, is if you're defamed in such a way that makes it difficult to earn a livelihood, it may take a decade and $500,000 to use litigation to try to seek redress for that. So that's challenging, but like I said, I'm optimistic that it's a meritorious case.
We have a clip from the documentary I want to show people, and then we'll wrap things up in a moment, but people can take a look at that right now.
Controversy surrounding a United Conservative Party candidate has caused her to step down.
Yes, Caylan Ford has resigned as a UCP candidate in the riding of Calgary Mountain View after a report claiming she echoed white nationalist rhetoric.
What was shared was her private messages. She was engaged in a Facebook chat with somebody.
The accusation was that she had said something in a private conversation that had echoed the words of white supremacists.
Caylan Ford says those Facebook messages were taken out of context.
The statement did not have one word of contrition, apology, or backing down from those statements.
The NDP has now started running attack ads framing the United Conservative Party as intolerant.
I was utterly shocked to hear of the comments that that candidate, who was of course a star candidate for the UCP, made.
That is a bit of When the Mob Came, featuring and produced by Caylan Ford. It comes out tonight. Congratulations on this. I know this has obviously been 4 years of your life now, and as we've discussed, the story is still unfolding in some ways, but I'm glad you're standing up and talking about this, Caylan. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.